Hi, I'm Bud from Strum Supply. Today in this part 3 of this series, Music Theory for Guitar, I'm going to talk about intervals. And if you want to learn about intervals and build a solid foundation that will help you learn the fretboard faster and in general master the guitar faster, you're in the right place. Intervals in music is simply the distance between notes. There are a lot of ways you could talk about the distance between notes or tones. Let's start by remembering that there are 12 semitones in each octave. This is a very natural thing for the guitarist because we're used to thinking that if we play on the 12th fret on any string, that we are in fact one octave above that open string. And we also know that there are 12 frets. We can play up those 12 frets to hear all 12 semitones. So it's very natural for us to think about the distance between tones or notes in terms of the fret distance. The fret distance is always equal to the semitone distance. But also recall that we've learned about the formula or structure of the major scale. Whole, whole, half step, whole, 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 half step. And so with that structure, you can also talk about the relative interval between tones. So for instance, let's talk about in the key of G major, G is the first tone, A is the second tone, B is the third tone, C is the fourth tone, etc. So we could say that C is the fourth of G in the G major scale, and that's another way to think about intervals. Now let's build on the foundation of both the scale intervals and the semitone intervals and think about what is the relative interval between the strings of the guitar when it's in standard tuning. Now recognize there are a lot of different tunings. Well, I'm going to only talk about standard tuning. And so in standard tuning, if you're as old as I am, you've been around as long as I have, you remember before we had digital tuners, that we would learn that if we could tune our E string, our low E string, to the piano or to some kind of a tuning fork or some reference, then all we had to do was play the E string on the 5th fret, and that would be an A. Well, playing the E string on the 5th fret gave us the note for the next string. And so this 5th fret on the E string is the tone for the open A. And when you tuned this string until it sounded like the E string on the 5th fret, you had the A string in tune. And then if you played the 5th fret on the A string, you got the open D. And if you played the 5th fret on the D string, you got the open G. And here's where there was a little bit of a anomaly in that for the B string, you were playing the 4th fret of the G string. And then you're back to, on the B string, you play on the 5th fret, and that gives you the open E. So this gives us a clue that, in fact, except for the 2nd string, guitars are tuned to the 4th tone of the string above it. And so the way to think about that is that this string is tuned to the 4th tone of the E major scale, the string that is above it. And this string is tuned to the 4th tone of the A major scale, the string above it. And so guitars are tuned in fourths. Now, a fourth is, in any key, it's always 5 semitones. Remember, a whole step is 2 semitones, so 2, 4, 5. That takes us to the 4th. And so we can think of it as 5 semitones. We can think of it as 5 half steps, 5 frets. But knowing that the strings are tuned in fourths gives us this interesting pattern. And hang with me for a minute. This might be a little confusing. I'm calling this 1 because it's the root of some scale. And it is, in this case, because I'm playing the 5th fret of the E string, this is an A, right? E, F, G, A. And a minute ago, remember I said that if you played the 5th fret of the E string, it gave you the open A. So this is the root of the A major scale. And what we know is that this note is the same as this note. Well, this is also the root of the A major scale. It's the one note. And if you were to go up in the intervals of this major scale, this is the 4 note. This relationship between the two strings is a very useful interval pattern. And so let's see some of the ways that it's useful. So first of all, it works on all of the strings except the relationship between the G and the B string. So that being an exception, you can move this up and down the neck. You can move from string to string, and wherever you play a note, you can know that the 4th of that note is the string below it, on the fret below it, right? So directly below on the same fret, you're playing the 4th of that root note. Now, only the 2nd string is an exception, and that B string, because it's tuned to the 3rd, you have to come up a fret. And so that's the trick. If you want to play the pattern onto the B string, you always have to remember to go up 1 fret. So since we know this 1-4 relationship, and it works on 5 of the 6 strings, then it's very easy for us to realize that not being interested in the 4th, one thing we are always interested in is the 1-3-5 pattern, because that's the major chord of any key. And so if you place your root anywhere up and down the neck, you can find the 1-3-5 pattern. We know the 3 is a half step below the 4. We know the 5 is a whole step above the 4. So therefore, anywhere I move my root, I can find my 3 and 5 relative to that very quickly using this pattern. And so here's also, just to reinforce, because the E string is tuned to the 4th of the B string, then this pattern works on the B and E string. Where it wouldn't work is if you placed your root on the 3. You would have to move these up 1. So let's just say keep the B as an exception, and while you're learning this, and then recognize that this pattern can be up and down the neck. It can be on any of the strings other than coming across that B string. So here's a great example. The 3rd fret on the A string is C. All right, so the C, E, G, and that's the 3 notes in the C major chord. Now, once again, going back to the image we used to learn the major scale formula, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, the way to translate this over to the guitar is simply to remember that every whole step is 2 frets. And so another way to think of this is that the major scale formula is 2 frets, 2 frets, 1 fret, 2 frets, 2 frets, 2 frets, 1 fret. And that helps us to think in terms of frets or semitones or the intervals on a guitar. Now, thinking in terms of intervals and the major scale, I just said that it's 2 frets is the whole step, 2 frets is the whole step, 1 fret, right? So you could play the E major scale by going up the neck in this pattern. It's a good pattern to know because using this pattern makes it easy for you to name the notes in the E, the A, the D, the G, the B, any of these. You can just run up the neck and quickly realize this A, B, C sharp, right? And so this pattern up the neck is a good way to cement the idea of the intervals of the major scale on any string. However, it's not a very practical way to play a scale because you have to move your left hand, you have to run up the neck. And in fact, this E, which is way up here at the 12th fret, can be found quite handily down here in the 2nd fret on the D string. And this G, way up at the 12th fret, can be played right here on the E on the 3rd fret. So keeping your hand down in the first position, you can play the G major scale using a pattern like this. What I've added here is some left-hand notation, quite common notation you'll see where index finger, 2nd finger, ring finger, pinky, and in this case you can see the pattern of the G major scale, which is you would play 2nd finger, 4th finger, 1st finger, 2nd finger, 4th finger, first finger, third finger, fourth finger. And you can also see that there are the half steps between B and C, and between F sharp and G, and then the whole steps between G and A, between A and B, between C and D, between D and E, between E and F. So that gives us our whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Another way to think about this, though, is the tones or the intervals of the scale. And so this is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of the major scale. And you can think of it that way so that you can quickly say, well, I need to find the 4, 5 in the key of G. Well, if I put my finger on the root on the E string, this is G, and then I know that the 4 is right below it, which would be a C, and I know that the 5 is 2 frets above it, which would be a D. So there you have it. Very quickly, you can find the 1, 4, 5 relationship by simply using this interval pattern. Also, it's good to know that this pattern, because it only uses 3 strings, you can put the root down on the A string somewhere, which makes it quite convenient. So if I wanted to talk about C, I would just drop down. This is a C right here, make that the 1, and then I would know that the 4 is here, the 5 is here, etc. So the pattern is very useful. It can be done up and down the neck. It can be done with the root in either the E string or the A string, and it very quickly gives you a way to find a scale. Now, there's one other pattern I'm going to introduce, and because I've moved up the neck a ways, I've put the dots on the fretboard. So this is 3rd fret, 5th fret, 7th fret. And this pattern uses the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd string. Very common pattern. This is used a lot for people to do soloing and impromptu sort of freestyling, because if you know what key you're playing in, you know that these are the notes of that key, and any of those notes are going to sound good. And so the reality for me is that because I know the E string well, and I learned the E string and the positions of the E string in terms of notes, I know that the 8th fret, and this just happens to be the 8th note, but it's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th fret, right? And this is the 7th, this is the 8th. The 8th fret is where I'm putting my pinky, and I know that the 8th fret on the E string is a C. Therefore, I know that I'm playing the C major scale here. And that I can, if I were to drop my pinky down to the 5th fret, I would be playing the A major scale. So it's a really easy way to remember this pattern and to use it. So that is understanding guitar intervals. I hope you found it useful. Please leave your comments, any suggestions, good ideas for using intervals, remembering intervals. Leave me ideas about future topics, and I hope to see you next week when I'm back with another lesson.